We are also going to be restoring the names to Fort Pickett and Fort Robert E. Lee.
I think we should put up a new Robert E. Lee statue to replace every single one that was taken down and make it 5 times larger. President Trump spoke at Fort Bragg yesterday, and he made an announcement about some changes that will be made and they've already started making these changes. They're going to continue to. Changes that I think are quite good, but let's listen to the announcement.
For a little breaking news, we are also going to be restoring the names to Fort Pickett, Fort Hood, Fort Gordon, Fort Rucker, Fort Polk, Fort A.P. Hill, and Fort Robert E. Lee. We won a lot of battles out of those forts. It's no time to change. And I'm superstitious. You know, I like to keep it going, right? I'm very superstitious. We want to keep it going.
So they'll be restoring the names of a bunch of U.S. forts that had been named after Civil War generals. And that includes restoring the name of the fort named after Robert E. Lee, according to Donald Trump. And I think this is great news. But, of course, it isn't really being treated like great news by everybody. Naturally, the left is having a hissy fit about it. I don't really care about that. It's not even worth addressing. Instead, I do want to try to talk about this a little bit and break this down for people on the right who generally opposed tearing down statues and renaming forts and buildings and all that kind of thing, but who supported it and still do for Confederate generals. There are, from what I've seen, and I don't know what the percentage is, but I've certainly seen a fair number of conservatives who hold that position and who think it's a bad idea to put somebody like Robert E. Lee's name back on a fort or to resurrect his statues, which I think we should be doing that also. I think we should put up a new Robert E. Lee statue to replace every single one that was taken down and make it 5 times larger, just to spite the mob that tore it down and to make it impossible for them to tear it down again. So, but this is not a universally accepted position on the right. Far from it, I would say. So I wanted to talk about this a little bit because I believe that there's a lot of ignorance about the Civil War. Of course, there's a lot of ignorance about it. And in particular about men like Robert E. Lee. And I'm going to focus on his case in particular. And when I say ignorance, by the way, I don't even mean that as an insult, because it's not entirely your fault. If you're ignorant about the real history of the Civil War, what that tells me is that you went to public school, as I did, or even private school. Most private schools, it's the same, where you are going to be hopelessly misinformed about the Civil War and every other historical subject, particularly subjects relating to American history. And unless you specifically went and pursued a better education on the subject, which you would have had to pursue independently on your own time, unless you did that, then you have never received anything approaching a real education on the Civil War. If you relied on the school system to teach you about it, and that's kind of as far as your education on the subject goes, then you know nothing about it. You really have zero in fact, you're in the negative. It's not just that you lack information. The information you think you have is wrong. So, but a lot of people, this is the problem with having a hopelessly corrupted school system, is that you're getting a lot of misinformation. You're getting a lot of left-wing propaganda. Obviously, you're being brainwashed. And then you have to go after the fact, after you graduate, and deliberately try to undo the brainwashing. But you don't have time to go and explore every single subject that they got wrong in school. And so a lot of people just Civil War doesn't interest them that much, so they don't spend the time to read about it. And so they go through their lives harboring all these misperceptions that were instilled in them by the school system. So with that said, here's the truth about Robert E. Lee, and which is, to just summarize, he was not some sort of belligerent racist who led troops into battle in the hope of overthrowing the U.S. government because he wanted to protect slavery. That's not the case. I think that's what most people today think That's the perception. That is just not the reality. That's not what happened. Lee entered the war on the side of the South, yes, but not for the sake of defending slavery, just as Lincoln didn't enter it for the sake of freeing the slaves. In fact, Lincoln said that if he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would do that. Lincoln said if he could save the Union without freeing any slaves, he'd do that. If he could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, he'd do that too. If he could save the Union by keeping some people enslaved and some not, he would do that. Those were his words. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that was very, very close to the direct quote. And Lee, for his part, didn't want to go to war to defend slavery. In fact, Lee said that slavery was a moral evil. Now, you'll hear that Robert E. Lee owned slaves himself, which is true, but it needs context. Just as if you're investigating something that happened in history, especially something that happened in another century, something that happened in the mid 19th century or earlier than that, you always need to keep in mind context. So, did he own slaves? Yeah, just as some Union generals owned slaves. Grant owned at least one slave for a period of time. There were other Union generals who owned slaves. Lee owned slaves because he inherited them from his father's estate. And it said in his father's will that he was to free the slaves after a period of time, which he did. He was the executor of the estate, and he followed his father's wishes. And the slaves were freed before the Emancipation Proclamation, even though the Emancipation Proclamation actually didn't free a single slave, because it was written specifically to free the slaves only in the states that were in rebellion, which were the states that Lincoln did not have control over at the time, and specifically did not free the slaves in the states that he did have control over. So, but that's a sort of a slightly different topic. So that's his actual history of slavery. Now, if you're going to take the position that, okay, yeah, but he still technically owned slaves for a period of time and he inherited them, he didn't free them right away. He obviously didn't have an enlightened view on the topic. Yeah, he didn't have an enlightened view on the topic by our standards today. Nobody did at that time. And if owning slaves means that somebody is not worthy of being respected or remembered or honored, well, I got news for you about like every person in history, if you go back 200 years or earlier, because all of them, if you go back far enough, either owned slaves or they didn't own them because they weren't rich enough, but they were okay with the institution. They believed in the institution. They were fine with it. That describes every single person who lived on the planet up until, around the 19th centuries when that started to change. The founding fathers owned slaves. So and this, by the way, is the logic that the left uses to tear down the founding fathers. Take their names off of things, tear down their statues. Right? We're talking about about 90 years that separated America declaring independence from the Civil War. So this is, in our day, that's one lifetime, two lifetimes back then. Not that long of a difference. Not that great of an expanse of time. And yet, if you're a reasonable person, you can look at our founding fathers and say, yeah, these are men who should be honored and remembered. And yes, they did also, many of them, own slaves. But we can understand that in the context of the time. And if we're not going to read history that way, then we're not reading history at all. So why did Lee fight for the Confederacy? Well, because he was a Virginia man. And back in those days, and this is hard for us to understand, but back in those days, especially in the South, your state was your country. If you heard somebody refer to their country, they would often be talking about their state. Lee was more loyal to his state and identified with it more than he did the federal government. His state is where which kind of makes sense, especially back in those days when people were not connected by modern technology. And so the only people you ever saw or heard from or heard about or interacted with were the people in your community. If the people who lived in states 500 miles away, you would just never see them ever, or hear about them, or hear from them, or talk to them. And so he identified with his community where he lived, and it's where his wife and children lived also. So when he was offered command of the Union Army, he declined. He declined it because he could not go to war against his own home, against his own community, against his own children. He had sons that were fighting age. He'd be fighting against his own kids. And he gave this as a reason. His direct quote was, I cannot raise my hand against my community, my home, and my children. That's the reason. He saw it as a choice to fight against his birthplace and his home or to fight to defend it. And he chose the latter. And I think that's a choice that reasonable people should be able to understand. You know, it can be hard for us to wrap our minds around the mindset of people back in those days, but that's a poor reflection of our mindset today, not of theirs, because people back then, especially guys like Lee, had a very strong sense of honor and duty, and in a way that almost nobody does today. Almost nobody does. But Lee did. And so for him, the idea that he would, because, you know, the other response that you'll often hear is, well, okay, well, he didn't have to fight at all. Why didn't he just sit it out? Well, the idea that he would sit it out and not fight at all was just unthinkable. Like, that just simply was not an option. Robert E. Lee is a military man, a man of honor and duty, fought with distinction in the Mexican-American War. He was not going to sit at home while other men fought. He wasn't going to sit at home while his kids with sons went out and fought. That couldn't happen. So he had to take a side. He didn't want to, but he didn't choose the fight. He didn't start the war. In fact, he was opposed to secession. That's another thing you probably didn't learn if you were relying on the school system to teach you about these things. His take on secession was that he thought it was a huge mistake and it shouldn't happen. And yet at the same time, he also thought that it would be a huge mistake for the North to try to maintain the Union through force. So he didn't want the South to secede, but he also didn't want the North to try to prevent it by force. He didn't want the South to secede. He didn't want Virginia to secede, but if they were going to do it, he'd be with them, you know? And, that was his take. I think it's a pretty reasonable take. So he was opposed to secession. He thought slavery was a moral evil, and yet he fought for Virginia. Why? Well, because he felt duty bound to do so. He believed that duty transcends the desires of the individual, which means that he would march in defense of Virginia, even as Virginia did something that he didn't personally agree with. And again, I know this mentality is just totally unthinkable for people today for whom the desires of the individual always reign supreme, but that was just not the case for almost any of the men who fought in the Civil War on either side. In fact, there were plenty of guys on the other side who didn't agree that it was a good idea to march down south and force them to stay in the Union at the point of a bayonet, and yet they did it anyway, not because they were moral cowards, but for precisely the opposite reason, because they had a strong sense of duty, which came before their personal desires. They saw their personal desires as less important than their duties as men. So he marched in defense of his home, and in the process, he showed incredible brilliance as a commander and military tactician. He fought in battles where he was very often hugely outnumbered and outgunned. He won battle after battle that way. The Battle of Chancellorsville, in particular, is considered one of his finest moments. 60,000 men against 130, 140,000 men, something like that. Pulled off these incredibly daring maneuvers, actually choosing to divide his very small force multiple times to pull off these extremely risky flanking maneuvers. But they were smart risks, and the only way to win against those odds is to take smart but bold risks. And Lee was one of the greatest military minds, certainly in American history, when it came to that sort of thing. And he ultimately lost the war, of course, but he put up a much, much better fight than most people expected. And then after they lost, he became a champion for reconciliation, for reunification, consistent with his sense of duty that he had. And he also, because for men like that, back in those days, it was, okay, we're going to go fight. We're going to fight in this war. Even if I don't fully agree with it, it's my duty as a man. I'm going to fight anyway. Okay, now we've lost, and that's it. We lost fair and square, and we're going to accept that. And that's what, that's how a man like Robert E. Lee thought. So does he deserve to be remembered by history and honored for the positive qualities that I've already listed? Yes. So in summary, yes, he does. And the people who, the people who talk, oh, he was just a traitor, he was nothing, but these people can't even conceive of the level of honor and dignity that guys like Robert E. Lee and men on both sides of the battle possessed. They can't even, they don't even have in their pinky finger that level of honor and dignity. They can't, it's like these were men. These were real men. And I think that, yes, I think it's a good thing for us to honor and remember them. And we were able to do that in this country for a long time, for generations. What I'm saying right now would have been, I wouldn't even need to be said. It wouldn't have been a revelation to anybody. This was generally how people felt. And only in the last few years are we suddenly acting as though the wounds of the Civil War are just too fresh, too raw for us to, for us to have any kind of nuanced view of somebody like Robert E. Lee. So it's the wounds are too raw and too fresh for us, and somehow they're more raw and fresh for us than they were for people whose grandfathers actually fought in the war. Makes no sense. So there's your history lesson for the day. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.